this out. And although motive is not an element and nothing that needs to be proven, we still talked about the motive that Nancy Brophy had to kill Dan. Now, defense spent some time in their opening statement, and I'm certain they're going to spend some time in their closing argument, saying, well, that motive is bogus because they had this retirement plan. They weren't in financial trouble. They had this plan moving forward that was going to save them, bring them out of the worst financial situation that they've ever had. Now, what did they tell you about this plan? Well, they said a lot, but what became clear is it's clearly a plan that was concocted for you. This wasn't something that they talked with family and friends about. They maybe mentioned the idea of the thought of selling their house. But remember what Matt Gitchell said about the retirement plan? It was like throwing darts at a map. It was all talk. They just ideas that they had for the future, as most people probably do. Even younger than the Brophies, they talk about their future. But there was no concrete plan, as defense would have you believe. And they point to that to say, well, because of this retirement plan that they have, that means they don't have any financial struggles. And so why would she need to kill Dan? It's really the only thing that defense can point to say, well, there's no need. But you have to remember, nobody knew about it. They just created this for you. And they pull little bits and pieces throughout time to show you that this must have been the plan. But the problem with that is Dan clearly had no intentions of retiring, as we've very well established. Dan wasn't going along with this plan. Doesn't appear that he knew about any plan that they were retiring. In fact, the only two people that you heard from that mention an actual plan, Dan retiring at 68 or 70, what the plan was moving forward, you heard from two people that told you there was a plan. Do you remember who those were? They were two defense experts. Not friends, not family. Two paid defense experts that got all of their information from the defense. One of them even said, well, I assumed they asked Nancy for this information. That's the only time you heard of an actual plan. What was that plan? Their big plan was they were going to subdivide this property. Now, when I say they're taking little bits and pieces from their history within the past year, let's say, and then they're building a story around it for you. Because they did talk to somebody about the possibility of subdividing the property, right? They talked to Richard Frymark. He testified and said, I'm an old acquaintance of Nancy's. She approached me, she asked me about the possibility of subdividing the property. He had a little bit of information he provided to them and then gave them a list of names. Or I shouldn't say them, Nancy. He gave Nancy a list of names. One of those people was Nick White. He was an engineer that could potentially help with the process of subdividing the property. Now, Nancy got on the stand and said, yeah, I did talk to Richard Frymark. He gave me a list of names, and I called one of them. She thought, she wasn't sure of the name. When I said the name Nick White, that sounded right to her. Something from KS Engineering, something like that is what she agreed to. And she said she talked to him about this, consulted with him about the possibility of subdividing the property. Then Nick White came in and talked to you. And Nick White said, never heard of her. Another Nancy lie. He not only never heard of her, he said he went back through their records, through their database to see, had anybody in this company talked to her? Had anybody had a conversation with her? Have they called in? Has there been any communication with this company and the Brophies? And the answer was no. So she takes these pieces, she builds upon them, thinking nobody's going to follow up. Nobody's going to follow up. Yeah, I called and talked to so-and-so, I talked to this person, don't really remember his name, but we figured it out. And that person came in here and said, that's not true. It's because they got a little bit of information about how to subdivide that property, and it's very difficult. And they abandoned that plan. The reason you know that is because she also talked to her neighbor, Paul Johnston, who's a realtor. And Nancy talked to Paul Johnson about the possibility of subdividing the property like a neighbor did. And Paul told you, I got this sense through this conversation with Nancy that she wasn't interested. No further conversations about subdividing the property. So what are they talking about? They just want you to accept that this is a great plan to subdivide the property. They're going to make a bunch of money and everything's going to be fine. But it's not true. It's based on the premise of a single conversation with Richard Freimark, and everything else is a lie. What else did Nancy lie about in regards to these people? Paul Johnston. She told you that Dan and Paul Johnston had things in common like the garden. They shared sauces, they had conversations, that Dan and Paul Johnston knew each other and friendly with each other. Nancy was there for conversations between the two of them. Another lie. Paul Johnston sat up here and said, I had one conversation with Dan. He was the guy who dropped off coffee grounds in my garden. I didn't know who it was. And he came out one day as Dan's driving by and they have a short conversation. Nancy was nowhere to be found in that conversation. Another lie. Nancy cannot help herself but to develop stories to explain why she does what she does. And if you notice, she sprinkles those lies among people. It's not just the things that we've covered. Think about the things that she's told people. She chooses who she tells certain things to so that they have bits of information, but she's never forthcoming. Right in line with what Dr. Warford said. Dr. Warford, although she opined that Nancy was forthcoming, she said that. She then later says in the same evaluation that Nancy Brophy won't even admit her shortcomings, basic shortcomings. Nancy wants to always look good. She wants the relationship to always look good. So of course everybody on the outside when talking to Nancy goes, they appeared to have a wonderful relationship. Because that's what Nancy made sure they knew. As I said before, you can look throughout this trial and you can point to many lies perpetrated by Nancy Brophy. Just like when she told you she always goes to Vernonia, that turns out not to be true. And that was part of the retirement plan as well. Nancy Brophy, the reality is she was not planning a retirement in early 2018. She was planning a murder. Retirement was not what she had plans for with Dan Brophy. She might have had her own retirement plans after the murder was carried out, but nothing with Mr. Brophy. When you go back to June 2nd and think about what happened and think about the stories that Nancy has told, just look at that timeline and look at that black bar right in the middle of the timeline heading from left to right. That's the time that Nancy doesn't remember, so she says. That morning she gets up in a scene on video, driving around downtown. She doesn't remember that. She drives back home, she's seen by the neighbors, she doesn't remember that. All the way up to the point, of course, when she remembers the call from Maxine Bourjardin, which again, inconsequential facts. That's why she's able to remember them. Nancy suffers not from retrograde amnesia or anterograde amnesia. Nancy suffers from convenient amnesia. She doesn't remember the things that she doesn't want to tell you about. Whenever it's convenient for her, that's what she doesn't remember. But what does she remember? All the non-critical pieces, very specific. The call from Maxine Bourjardin, the call to Dan, the text to Dan, the calls back and forth to Maxine Bourjardin, the calls to Karen Brophy and the content of that call. She remembers getting dressed. She remembers getting in her car. She remembers driving to the Culinary Institute. She remembers white knuckling the steering wheel. She remembers playing with the radio. She remembers parking. She remembers talking to police officers. She remembers being walked into the tape. She remembers talking to detectives. She remembers being interviewed by detectives. She remembers talking to a tips volunteer and what that content was. She remembers talking to detectives further. She remembers driving back home with the detectives driving her home in order for her to give a gun to the detectives that is not the murder weapon. She remembers all of that, but nothing at a critical moment. Nancy murdered Dan Brophy on a day he would be alone, in a place where there are no cameras, in a place that would pay the most money upon his death. No one else had the knowledge that Nancy Brophy had. No one else had the plan that Nancy Brophy had, nor the opportunity, and certainly not the motive. Nancy Brophy possessed all of those. And upon the conclusion of these arguments, we are going to be asking you to return a verdict of guilty for the murder of Dan Brophy. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Overstreet. Defense, do you need a moment to set up for 5 minutes?
Sure. Thank you.
Well, I'm asking, I don't know how.
If it works for
Okay,
you.
let's
Yeah.
plan on taking a 10-minute break and then we'll hear the defense closing.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You may be seated or you may remain standing until Judge Ramirez takes the bench in just another minute. All rise.
All right, please be seated. And Ms. Weinmiller, when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for being here day after day after day and week after week. We do understand what kind of commitment you've made to be here, and we appreciate that from each and every one of you. Yes. The American system of justice is unlike no other. In this country, we do not convict the accused person on suspicion, on conjecture, or on guesswork. In American courts, we insist that the prosecution prove the person's guilt beyond all reasonable doubt and with decent, reliable evidence. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean maybe she is guilty. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean probably she is guilty. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not even mean almost certainly she is guilty. To convict a person in this country, you must be certain. If there is any reasonable possibility that Nancy Crampton Brophy is not guilty, you must give her the benefit of the doubt and return a verdict of not guilty. Let me say that again because it's very, very important. If there's any reasonable possibility Nancy Brophy is not guilty, you must give her the benefit of the doubt, and you are required under our system of laws to return a verdict of not guilty. For perspective, let's talk about how the rest of this courthouse works, how other proceedings work, the level of proofs that we use in American courts. Probable cause is the lowest of the standards that we apply in this system. It means there's a good chance it's true. It is enough evidence for the police to kick in your door, to search through your bedroom. It's not nothing, but that's the very lowest standard that we apply in our courts. A preponderance of the evidence means that it's more likely than not that it's true. More likely than not that it's true. That's the second of the 4 stages of proof. That's what's needed to convict a person, for instance, of running a red light. The second to highest is called clear and convincing. And clear and convincing is defined as evidence which does not leave the issue seriously in doubt. That's the second highest stage of evidence, proof. That stage, or that level of proof, is what's required for the government to take your children away from you. But even that is not the highest level of proof, and not the level of proof that you're required to apply here today. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that's the very highest standard of proof, and it requires the elimination of every reasonable doubt. If there's any reasonable possibility that Nancy Crampton Brophy is not guilty, you must give her the benefit of that doubt. You must return a verdict of not guilty. The prosecution must prove a person's guilt beyond all reasonable doubt, and it must prove that with decent, reliable evidence. And in this case, the state has failed in that. The love that Nancy and Dan Brophy had for each other was no mere possibility. It was the best proven fact in this trial. You've heard about possibilities throughout this trial. Many, many, many possibilities. You heard today about many, many, many possibilities, a theory. But the love story of Nancy and Dan Brophy was woven throughout the entire trial. It was told from a different angle by each witness who was lucky enough to have known them both. It was even told by the witnesses who knew one much better than the other. And it didn't matter which party called the person to testify. Every single witness who knew them told you their piece their observations of that love story. This love that Nancy and Dan had for each other, it was no mere possibility. It was the best proven fact in this trial. On the last morning they had off together, that they were free, Dan and Nancy Brophy went out for breakfast at the Six Corners Cafe. After breakfast, they went to a rummage sale. Of course, that was Dan's choice. They picked up a few items, including a toy chest for Nathaniel's daughter. Nancy spent the rest of the morning sanding it, applying a coat of primer, thought about how to puzzle through this hole in the story that she was working on. Dan puttered on his projects, and then they headed off to Avamere for a shift that evening. And you can see that in the bank records, that that's what they did on the morning of June 1st. They slept in their bedroom, as they always did, but Nancy was up most of the night, reworking this trilogy that she was readying for publication. Dan went to sleep long before she finally crashed, and in the morning she awoke to him wondering about the wet towels that were piled up in the sink. It appeared he'd already been up, feeding the chickens, walking the dog, his well-established morning routine. That began at 4 a.m., a time that Nancy then considered far too early to start the day. Dan had to address the leak before he left for live fire at OCI, so Nancy imagined she went out to pick up a Starbucks for herself at the drive-thru. She remembers the conversation about the leak. She remembers pulling on tights. She remembers them both readying for their respective days. And that was the last time she saw her husband. That was the last time she saw the man she loved. There are promises, and then there are promises. Dan and Nancy made a promise to share their lives, a promise that they reaffirmed just a couple of years before he died, and they kept that promise to each other. On June 2nd, 2018, they were looking forward to a gradual wind down that almost certainly would have them moving further out of town and into a smaller place with good land, a place they both hoped would be near but not in the foothills of the coastal range. A dream that Dan Brophy's mother agreed would make him happy. They were looking for maybe a smaller plot of land outside of Portland where he could have a big garden and all the chickens he wanted and that kind of thing. And that would be Dan's ideal retirement, I think. That's what she told you. There were promises that were not kept, but those weren't promises that Dan and Nancy Brophy failed to keep. Those were promises that weren't kept in this courtroom. The state's numbers collapsed during testimony. No matter how it's described to you here today, they collapsed during the testimony that was presented to you. There was a lot of, it's possible, but what you were told in the prosecution's opening statement was that Nancy Brophy made claims on 10 different life insurance policies in which she is the beneficiary of over $1.4 million. That's not the way it was recast for you today. It was phrased differently. It was harmonized in a sense. But that is what you were told at the beginning of the case, and that's what the state thought was true when this prosecution began. They were wrong. That collapsed spectacularly. The prosecution led with that theory of motive. Nancy Brophy was counting on a huge insurance payout. But that's flatly untrue. One of the most misguided claims the prosecution made to you at the beginning of the case was that Dan Brophy was worth more to Nancy Brophy dead than alive. That's why we brought in Dan Rubinson, the economist, the emeritus professor from Southern Oregon. He told you that even the standard economic calculation for the loss of a man with Dan Brophy's demographic profile is that he was worth $1,133,032 to his wife. Dr. Rubinson explained that he's not allowed to consider or include intangibles. He's not allowed to factor in Dan Brophy's delightfully dry sense of humor, his wit, his extraordinary contributions around the household, and you heard about that over and over. They were extraordinary. What he presented to you is what a standard average man, the calculation that's made for a standard average man of his age and income in this part of the world. That's $1,133,032. That's significantly more than Nancy Brophy could hope to see from the insurance policies that they in fact held, not these imaginary policies that she made imaginary claims against, but the insurance actually in force was significantly less than that. It turns out that there was some poorly described safe benefit that would be available to her too, but there was no evidence. There was absolutely no evidence in this trial that she was ever aware of that before her husband died. And what you heard is that that would come in monthly increments that were more like a Social Security check. And if she lived to a very, very, very old age, that maybe someday that would add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it would take a considerable period of time for that to happen. And when we're talking about motive, what really matters most of all is that there was no evidence that that was something that she was aware of, that she would somehow thought might be available if her husband someday died at work. The bottom line is that Nancy Brophy was far better off, far, far better off with Dan Brophy in her life. Even if you look at it just in pure economic terms, even if you ignore the love, even if you ignore all of those intangibles that couldn't go into that calculation, she was better off with Dan alive. And all the state could say in response to that with Dr. Rubinson was, but what if they were going to get divorced? What if a divorce was in the offing? Well, then it wouldn't work out that way. Then that money wouldn't be coming in and those services wouldn't be coming in for all those future years. There wasn't a single witness. There was not one single witness who came in and gave you actual evidence that would support that kind of discord in the marriage, that there was even a chance, a remote chance, that the two of them were thinking about divorcing. That came only from the state's questions. And I suggest to you that fundamental lack of support for that theory should be very concerning to you. Steve Santos, the insurance expert, explained that the difference between his initial calculations, which presumably are why you heard about 1.4 million that she was trying to collect on in the opening statements, he explained that the difference between his initial calculations and his final numbers, the ones he testified to you about, could be explained by the fact that the project had been dumped on him a mere 24 hours or so before you heard the opening statements, before that representation was made to you. He said about 3 different times that he hadn't had sufficient time to go through that 1,000 pages or so of insurance policies. He'd done the best he could, and it really was an awfully big project to take on such very short notice. Now, as you know, this investigation is almost 4 years old. The case itself is well over 3.5 years old. How in the world Mr. Santos ended up with a project of that size a day or two before opening statements is just unfathomable. But the bottom line is that when he testified, Mr. Santos told you there was actually only $715,000 of life insurance on Dan Brophy on the day he died. The state had literally doubled, more than doubled the amount of money that Nancy Brophy, they claimed Nancy Brophy sought to collect. He was also wrong about the number of policies that were enforced when Dan Brophy died. He was wrong that Ms. Brophy tried to collect on more policies than were enforced. Come back to that when we talk about John Lenz, but I want to emphasize this again. Mr. Overstreet put up a slide this morning suggesting that Nancy Brophy herself thought that all that extra insurance was enforced and had made claims against all of it. That is patently untrue. That did not happen. She did not make claims against policies for $1.4 million. But Steve Santos's mistakes didn't dampen his willingness to talk down to the Brophies. He assumed that he knew better than they did themselves what they would need in the future. He talked about them almost as if they were wayward teenagers in need of his counseling. He offered the rather surprising opinion that rather than hang on to their coverage, which he eventually agreed was perfectly appropriate amount of coverage for them to have in place, that they should have given up their life insurance to avoid continued premium costs. He suggested that they could easily replace that insurance later, but without mentioning that it would be both expensive and anything but certain that the coverage could be resumed again at their presumably then advanced ages. It was poor advice, but it was completely outside his lane when we're talking about what you need to know to make a decision about Nancy Brophy's fate and what happened to Dan Brophy. John Lenz, on the other hand, testified that the life insurance amounts that Ms. Maxfield spelled out for you in our opening was only off by the amount of the small loan that the Brophies had taken against the Foresters policy when money was tight a year or two earlier. She told you in opening that the policies in force, that the life insurance in force was $815,000, and it turns out it was $809,000. John Lenz determined that the coverage on Dan Brophy's life had never, at any point in time, been any higher than $815,000. That there was no point at which all those extra Mutual of Omaha policies were actually in force all at the same time. 815 was a perfectly appropriate amount of insurance for the Brophy couple to hold on Dan Brophy's life. John Lenz also explained to you about how the American amicable riders could have provided a potential benefit even during Dan's lifetime if he developed long-term health complications that his wife couldn't manage on her own. He explained how the savings components of the two different policies worked, different from each other, and how the Brophies had used one to good effect already. He even explained how utilizing that as a cash source would mean that they could pay interest on loans they took out. They could pay themselves interest on those loans, just as they did with the 401k, rather than borrowing it from a bank or a financial institution or some other source that would require that interest be paid to it. They were borrowing from their own cash reserve. Now, you don't have to decide whether or not that was the perfect insurance plan, whether it's what you would do in their circumstance. You just have to understand that they were two thoughtful people that worked this out together. And for them, knowing that they were catching up and they didn't have huge assets to rely on in retirement, for them, this was a plan that made sense. And it's a plan that made sense to John Lenz as well. The takeaways from John Lenz were that Dan Brophy was not overinsured, with $809,774 available after the Forester's loan was deducted. The Brophies were not paying too much for that insurance. They were paying $778.58 by his calculation. I don't know that any of us have heard or understood completely where they were paying over $1,000 a month comes from. But what John Lenz told you after going through all of those policies and calculating which of the payments actually went to this coverage on Dan Brophy's life, that the amount that they were paying for that was $778.58. And he further told you that that fell within the guidelines that by insurance industry standards, which are not perfectly consistent. There is no one guideline. But when he went through those guidelines with you, he told you that that's an appropriate amount. That certainly as somebody who sells insurance and has been in that industry now for years, that he didn't think that was outside the bounds at all. He also gave you a few more details, told you about the American amicable riders and how that would work and what the conditions would be in which that would kick in, the age at which the AmeriCo policy could, whether it would be traded out or continued in force, the age at which that cash would be available, and that at 78, that would be about the time that people might well need that sort of extra cash bump for health-related reasons. He also explained that some of the policies that Mr. Santos had counted were plans that the Brophies had established for minor children in the family, both Susan Estrada's children and Nathaniel's. With those corrections to Mr. Santos's math, John Lenz showed that the Brophies were paying a reasonable percentage of their income for the coverage in force, and he rejected the advice, he strongly rejected the advice that the Brophies should have dropped their coverage. Instead, he took a much more realistic view of the risks of that strategy And in his opinion, their policy choices fit their goals. I want to emphasize again here that whether or not you think that those are the insurance choices that you'll someday make for yourselves or have already made for yourselves, that isn't something on which any sort of criminal conviction should be founded. We're bringing it up because that's the theory of motive that the state led with. That's why you were told she did this. And as he was getting close to closing his testimony, he was asked about whether Ms. Brophy had attempted to claim against these extra policies, whether she had really thought that, at least in her mind, that there was 1.4 million available to her. And he said no, he'd gone through thoroughly all of that paperwork, and it was clear to him that she had not done anything to try to collect against any policy that wasn't in force. And then when asked by Ms. Herman whether he had to call the companies to figure that out, maybe that was just a really tricky thing to figure out, and Mr. Santos could be excused for having made that mistake, his response in substance was, no, I just had to read the policy documents. He said, I did not call the insurance companies to determine how the policies worked. Our firm personally represents most of these companies and has for many years. I'm very familiar with them. And yes, I spent quite a bit of time looking at the policies. He did the work before he offered his opinion, and he didn't talk down either to you or to the Brophies. What you heard from the two financial experts followed the same pattern. Mr. Azor's presentation stood out for its scolding quality. He talked about Dan Brophy's financial choices in a manner that may have felt insulting even to his friends and family. Dan Brophy didn't need Robert Azor to tell him how to run his life. The tone of that presentation, or his several presentations, was that both Dan and Nancy Brophy were reckless and irresponsible and in need of a stern comeuppance from him. And the fuzzy math. The first time he testified, he couldn't tell you what the Brophy household income was. He had opinions about when they were going to run out of money. He had opinions about all sorts of things, whether it was too much for them to go out and have some pho or have some sushi. He had opinions about all sorts of things, but he hadn't even figured out what their household income was. And he hadn't done the work that Tiffany Couch had done to figure out what the patterns were and what was going on and whether there was evidence in their financial spending of a plan, of a concerted effort to wind down, to get rid of their debt, to move into a different phase of their lives. No, without doing any of that work, Mr. Azor testified to you both times that they were essentially on the brink of financial disaster. He also told you when he came back this past week that Dan Brophy worked less at Avamere in 2018 and 2017. But I'd ask you, while you're back there looking through the exhibits and considering all of this again, to just take a moment or two to glance through the Avamere time cards. It's the Defense Exhibit 256, and it's the full set of time cards for the year leading up to Dan Brophy's death. So you get more than half a year of 2017 and less than half a year of 2018, but a year in total. And if you divide the first by 7 and the second by 5, and look at those the running tally of hours over on the right-hand side, you'll see that Dan Brophy he clocked more hours in 2018, about 2 more hours a week than he had in 2017. He also, when he came back this past week, offered some formulas about his projections going forward, but when asked what numbers he'd plugged into the formulas to try to figure out why there was such a discrepancy in the numbers that we were getting, his answer essentially was, oh, I didn't know you'd want to see the numbers. I didn't bring those. I'm certain I'm right. But no, I can't tell you how I got to that number. I'm just telling you that they would have been broke by the end of the year. He did make one very important concession, though, during his testimony, and that was that if the Brophies had sold their house and they'd moved into a home that they could own free and clear, that would resolve their problems. That where they sat on the day Dan died, on June 2nd of 2018, that they were in a position then that merely taking equity out of the house getting a smaller house, or maybe not even a smaller house, a house further out of town, a cheaper house, a nice house, but something that they really truly could afford, and getting rid of that mortgage, that would make all the difference. And you did hear from Paul Johnston last week also, the realtor neighbor familiar with their property, the Brophy's property, lived right down the street. He said he thought they could sell it for as much as $700,000 if they cleared out the backyard and they returned it so it looked like a normal house, a property that would be attractive to many buyers. And Richard Freimark, of course, had come in earlier. He also is a realtor. He thought that they could sell it for even more if they did that. Of course, they would have to clear out the blackberries. But if they did that and they investigated whether it could be partitioned, they might even be able to make a little more than $700,000. And he told you that he was the one who recommended Nick White, that he was the one who had suggested that that was the way to put that all in motion. Now, when Ms. Brophy testified, she testified that she relied on that input, and it may be that she confused which of them had spoken directly to Nick White, but does it really matter? Richard Freimark told you that Nick White was the one that he had recommended and that that would be the way that it would play out, and even Mr. White told you, as did everybody else who saw that backyard or heard about it, that the first thing that had to happen was that the blackberries would have to go. They just had to be restored to a more reasonable status before anything could really move forward, before anybody was going to look at that property and think about purchasing it at a good price. So the one thing that we agree Robert Azor was absolutely right about is that selling their house on 108th and moving to a place that they could purchase for cash was their ticket to a financially stable retirement, a financially stable future. If they'd maximized the value of that property, as Freimark and Johnston had recommended, a sale of $700,000 would have netted them at least $400,000 because the remaining mortgage was about $250,000. So even if you take out all of the costs that can attend a sale, it really is a pretty conservative figure to think that they would have had $400,000 left over. You can find some pretty well-constructed, lovely homes in Oregon if you're willing to get outside of Portland for $400,000. Actually, for considerably less than $400,000. Tiffany Couch performed, as you know, as you saw, a much more thorough analysis than Robert Azor. I'm sorry, it's Azor. She shows her work. You can follow her math because it's complete. She spells it out. Her exhibits were very detailed. In fact, she prepared one exhibit that we have available to you that gives you all of the bank detail from all of the combined accounts. It's probably much, much more than you want to look through, but it's right there for you. If you want to check anything she told you, it's right there for you. The court rules, as we talked about at the very beginning in voir dire, and at least most of your panels, the court rules don't allow for her to testify a second time to respond to Mr. Azor's testimony during the state's rebuttal case. However, luckily, she was well prepared the first time and very thorough, and she was able to provide you with fully documented numbers to support her conclusions. And her primary conclusions were that the Brophies were fast retiring their debt. They would have been debt-free but for the mortgage by the end of 2018. That Dan Brophy was making considerably more than Robert Azor acknowledged because so much of his OCI income was going directly into his 401k. That speaks to retirement planning. Nancy Brophy was bringing in a growing and substantial income from her Medicare sales, enough so that she contributed very large cash infusions at the beginning of each year after she switched to Medicare. So 2017, 2018, some very large cash infusions, almost 20,000 just in that 1 month alone. And you'll see those figures in the exhibits. I think it was 19,000 one year and 17 another. But in addition to that, she was bringing in about 3,000 a month each of the other months. So she too was making a very substantial contribution with the switch to Medicare, to getting the two of them on much more solid footing going forward. Dan's second job at Avamere, Nancy didn't make him take that job. I mean, you heard Tanya Medlin talk about how he would sing at work. It was 6 minutes away from home, and she gave him all the high-paying shifts. She gave him the cherry shifts. Having that extra income come in meant that he was able to pay down those high interest credit cards that he'd been carrying for a very long time. He had those almost paid off completely. He was making good big payments against that second mortgage. They were doing all sorts of things that must have felt like a tremendous relief to them. He was making more at Avamere, it appears, than he was making at OCI. And he was working close to home, and he obviously really enjoyed Tanya Medlin. This couch was able to tell you that the Brophies were on the path to good financial health by June of 2018, that they were in a far better position than they'd been 2 years earlier, and that their financial decisions, even with respect to taking out the loan against the 401k, were sound decisions. Their decisions with respect to insurance, the loan against the 401k, the loan against the forester's policy, and especially their decision to aggressively pay down that debt, those were all very sound financial decisions. And if they hadn't been so aggressive in trying to pay down that debt, they wouldn't have had other cash flow problems. Part of that was a function of the fact that they'd let the credit cards get too high and they had to retire them. But they didn't have to pay it off right then in the amounts that they were paying it off. That shows a commitment, a really serious commitment to getting that debt out of their lives. And of course, it's common sense that anybody who works that hard to get their credit card paid off is not going to want to go back and charge against them again. But they did have that too available. They weren't desperate. They weren't in a position where they were just on the precipice and about to tip off into the deep abyss. There were a number of competing narratives in this trial, actually an unusual number. The one that stands out as the most absurd is this persistent insistence that the Brophies never would have planned for retirement. That unlike virtually every other household in the entire country, that retirement just wasn't a thing for them. Dan Brophy couldn't care less about retiring. He couldn't care less about being comfortable or being safe as he aged. And no matter how many times you hear that from the prosecution, remember that even people like Dan Brophy's own mother said, well, he was 64. Of course, I imagine he was starting to think about retirement. Who wouldn't? That's an excellent question. Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't be starting to think about it? And that takes years of preparation, as you all know. You can't just snap your fingers and decide one day, oh, well, I didn't save enough money and I've still got all those credit cards and yeah, there's some impediments, but I think I'll just, take the leap and retire now anyway. No, what Ms. Maxfield told you in the opening is that they had started a plan that was a plan that was going to continue with Mr. Brophy working. And their hope, their expectation was that he would be able to work through the age of 70, through the time that he could collect the maximum Social Security benefit, because they didn't have a huge amount of money in the bank. That extra year or two of waiting for Social Security might be really beneficial to them. And so they were going to try to hold on for that long. But they had started to plan. They had started to put that 5 or 6 year plan into action. So what Ms. Maxfield told you in her opening, it was that plan was this, the retirement plan was this, that Nancy Brophy would begin to take her own Social Security benefits because she now was 67, about to turn 68, and she would build, that would bring in a little bit of extra money, and that would help because they were still at a point that cash was a little tight. She would build a book of Medicare commissions from her new career focus on Medicare, that Dan, and this is what you were told by Ms. Maxfield in opening, that Dan Brophy would work at OCI for about 5 more years until he could collect the full Social Security amount as he approached 70, and that they would investigate subdividing their lot and then sell their house, and that they were hoping to do that in 2018. The state, though, turned that on its head, or tried to turn that on its head, and asked witness after witness whether Dan had told them he was about to retire. That question was a red herring. It's a misrepresentation of what you were told in our opening. The plan was for Dan to work until he was about 70, until he could maximize his Social Security payment, and that was about 5 more years. The Brophies were financially astute enough to know that that could matter. And Dan did love to teach. He loved OCI. He enjoyed it. He knew the stimulation was good for him. That's absolutely true. He wasn't ready to quit, and his wife didn't want him to quit. They just needed to get serious about laying plans for a comfortable future. There has been a lot of insinuation in this case about what Nancy Brophy was up to and whether their marriage was really as healthy as it appeared to be to everybody, even the people who knew them best. But not a single witness has offered even a shred of support for the prosecution's insinuation or supposition that the Brophies planned to separate or divorce. Not a single witness has offered any support for the idea that Nancy Brophy had fallen out of love with Dan Brophy, that money suddenly mattered more to her than her husband. Now, you heard her testify that she has a degree in economics. She's obviously a very astute woman. She's obviously a very social woman. She has so many friends and so many resources. If she was all about money, if the only thing that mattered to her is how much her husband made, if his happiness was nothing, if being creative was nothing, if the fact that he was a world-class chef was nothing, you think she couldn't have moved on before she was hitting her 25th year of marriage to him? That makes no sense. That's just an absurd suggestion. There is absolutely no evidence to back that up. It's just, well, we're sure she shot him, so she had to have a motive. So, well, here's one, maybe this fits. But there's nothing in her behavior that supports that. Nothing that, and I'm not asking you just to rely on her testimony, but the testimony of all of the other people who came in. There's just absolutely nothing to support that. What if? And the possibility. So what if, let's play this game. What if none of what you've heard from all these bright, caring, thoughtful people is true? And instead, the Brophies were secretly harboring plans to separate after 24 plus, so what was it, 24 years, 10 months, and some odd number of days? What if after all that time, they were secretly harboring plans to separate? What if, the state's theory seems to go, what if Dan Brophy, instead of being the good man virtually every witness described him to be, what if he harbored a secret, cruel, selfish side? And he had decided that they should refuse to monetize their most valuable asset, their home, as they approached older age. They should eschew the financial stability that would result from selling their home. What if Dan Brophy didn't want to monetize the one thing that could bring them true financial stability in their later years? And remember, Mr. Roloff told you on the day he died, Dan Brophy's phone, his cell phone, the one with the chicken picture on the back, the rooster picture on the back, his contact for his wife, what came up on his phone was Nancy, the love of my life. But what if all of that, none of that was true? What if, rather than waiting to move forward with the most ambitious landscaping, the expensive part that required heavy machinery, what if instead of just waiting until the weather turned and the ground was solid enough to bring in all that heavy machinery, what if instead that delay between the work that was done in the early winter and then the work that was resumed in the spring, what if that was all just because Dan Brophy was stalling? He didn't really want to do that work. He didn't really want to get rid of those blackberries. He was stalling because, well, having taken out that loan from his 401k, he decided he didn't really want to do the yard work, but he wanted to spend the money on chicken feed. What if rather than needing some time to figure out how to tackle that Rubik's Cube of a problem he had ahead of him and cleaning out that house, cleaning out that garage, cleaning out that basement, what if just rather than having to take some time to figure out how they were going to do this, how they were going to stage this, Dan Brophy just put that whole plan entirely out of his mind. He had no intention of proceeding with it. And what if he wanted that property so much, with all of its encroaching bramble of blackberry canes, his blackberries that had overwhelmed him? Several witnesses told you he'd become overwhelmed by them. They'd almost overtaken the house itself. What if he wanted that property so much that he decided that both he and Nancy would work right through their 70s and their 80s at the same brisk pace they'd been keeping up in their 60s in order to keep paying that mortgage? Because that's what it would take. Dan Brophy couldn't afford to stay in that house, and he knew it. He could do the math. He was good at math. He was so good at math that both the students and faculty sought him out to learn how to do the math right. Nancy Brophy could do the math. She's an econ major. They both, each of them, had to have figured out individually and in concert with each other, they had to have figured out with that $250,000 balance that they had left on that Wells Fargo mortgage, that they would have to make large additional payments, probably on the order of $16,000 extra on top of their mortgage payments, on top of the monthly obligation. They'd have to pay about another $16,000 a year if they ever wanted to own that house free and clear. That would take about another decade of their lives of making those kinds of extra payments to get to the point that they had that mortgage paid off. And until they did, they couldn't retire. They better not have a health problem. There better be nothing that slowed the two of them down. They better keep chugging away for that whole decade at the pace described, because they had $250,000 left to pay off on that mortgage. Dan was about to turn 64. It was June. He was going to turn 64 at the end of the month. Nancy was about to turn 68 a little bit earlier. To work for another decade at the hard pace that they had kept up in 2017 and 2018 would mean that they would both be working at that rigorous physical pace until Nancy was 78 and Dan was 74. And if they didn't, the mortgage alone was about $1,700 something, $1,800 at that point. Their Social Security pyramid, if they were in the house, if they hadn't gotten access to any of that equity, any of that cash, the Social Security was going to be eaten up. A huge portion of what they had coming in every month was going to be eaten up to try to pay off the balance of that mortgage. The cash flow that they experienced in 2016, 2015, 16, 17, that cash crunch would have been nothing compared to what they were looking at down the road once their income started to evaporate, as they do for all of us, inevitably. Dan Brophy also knew biology. In fact, he'd majored in biology. He knew it would be a shaky plan indeed to assume that his body would hold up to the rigors of working on his feet. He was working in a hot kitchen on his feet. Through his mid-70s, maybe he'd pull that off. Maybe he couldn't. He knew that. He knew it would be an even shakier plan to assume that his wife could hold up enough to work to the age of 78. What decent man would pin his future on the insistence that his wife work until she was 78, just so he could live in a house overwhelmed by an enormous bramble of blackberries? That's been known to happen. There are codgers like that in the world. We all know that there are outliers, that there are men who would do that. But what you know from having heard from all these witnesses is that Dan Brophy was not one of them. That's not who he was. He was an honorable man. He was a loving husband in an exemplary marriage. He loved Nancy Brophy, and he sought to protect her in many ways, large and small. The state's entire theory seems to be premised on the idea that he was not a man, that he was a man who would not hesitate for a minute to insist that his wife work until she was 78 because he said so. That's a fictional Dan Brophy. That's not the Dan Brophy you heard about from any witness who knew him. Not from Matt Gitchell or Delilah Marvell or Jack Brophy or Karen Brophy or Susan Estrada or Nathaniel Stillwater or Melanie Hamrickson, Tanya Medlin. Not from anybody. Not from a single person who knew him. The Dan Brophy you heard about, the Dan Brophy who actually graced this earth, was a much better man than that. That Dan Brophy adored his wife. He wanted her to live the last decades of her life as she deserved to live them. He wanted to enjoy his last decades with her, wandering the woods, whiling away the evenings with a glass of wine on the porch, living in a house they could manage with no debt, a house they could keep up even when they reached the point, as they inevitably would, that the only income coming in would be Social Security. A relatively stress-free life compared to the financially tumultuous couple of years they'd had after In Good Taste closed, and then almost simultaneously, Portland Nursery and Bob's Red Mill stopped offering their cooking programs for the home chef. He didn't want to go back to that tumult any more than his wife did. Dan Brophy was not a financially reckless or emotionally callous husband. He was a great husband, an almost perfect husband. His worst fault, in his wife's eyes, was that he didn't believe in locking doors or windows, their house or car. You heard that in the back and forth between Dr. Warford, the defense psychologist, and Mr. Overstreet, when he challenged her about the years and years of text messages that she'd reviewed. Dan Brophy's worst failing as a husband in his wife's eyes, the only time that she came close to getting crabby with him in that long exchange of text messages, was that he didn't lock up the house or car, but instead left the windows to the house open. A primary theme throughout the prosecution, and then let me just note there that it's important to see in that exchange even that Nancy Brophy had she'd started to get alarmed about safety, about personal safety. And that was something that maybe she was feeling a little bit more than her husband. It's not unusual for women that age to start thinking about vulnerabilities, but that comes out in that exchange that you heard between Mr. Overstreet and Dr. Warford. So a primary theme throughout the entire prosecution was that she, though, was engaged in a lengthy, ongoing, and clandestine plan to murder her husband. According to the state, the plan was executed one secret at a time. First, you heard that Ms. Brophy secretly rented a storage unit. There was all sorts of insinuation about Dan didn't know there was a storage unit. And yet, you'll see if you look in the On Point account, I don't remember if we have this call out as Exhibit 380 or whether that's the whole statement for the month, but you'll see that the On Point, the public storage was being paid for out of their joint On Point account. Not much of a secret. And then we have the text exchange that you'll see. Our yard guy is coming by at 2 today. Okay, does that mean we wait to visit storage? Yes. Seems a little silly if you're hiding the storage unit from him to ask him to go there to visit it with you. It's much more consistent with the idea that they were trying to figure out how they could get their house cleared out, how they could sell it. They certainly weren't going to sell it with all that stuff in the house. They're trying to figure out an economical way to get the house cleaned out so that they could sell it and then take the cash from the sale to buy a new place, a place that they could get for cash. You also heard about this secret purchase of the gun kit, a purchase made on Christmas Eve after Dan Brophy arrived home from his shift at Avamere. An admittedly somewhat frivolous present that Nancy Brophy got for herself. But that too is in the On Point records. That too was in the joint account for Dan Brophy to see. And in fact, not only was he home from work, you can look at the times on his time card when he punches out and the messages and figure out that that would have been purchased right about the time he got home. Not an hour before, not hours before, but right about the time he got home. But it also was delivered to their home. It was another item that was delivered right to their home, not to a secret post office box, not to anything else. That came right to their home and was paid for right out of their joint account. It also wasn't a secret from others. Linda Smith testified that Nancy Brophy had mentioned it to her ahead of time. Jessie Smith, Darla Lukenbaugh, Sue Lute were all aware that Nancy Brophy had this idea about the gun kit. If it were something that she had gotten, not as a writing device, but as something she thought she could use to execute this dastardly plot, would it make any sense at all for her to be buying it out of a joint account and talking not only with her husband, but with all these other people about it? Her description of what she was up to with those gun parts and her distinguishing between here's the gun we got for protection, here's the one that we got because I was starting to get really nervous about what was going on in society. I was on a society-wide level and also just on a personal level. I was starting to get nervous about whether we were really safe and whether we were naive not to have a gun. There was that, and then she clearly distinguished between that and the writing devices and told you that the gun kit and the slide were writing devices. And she didn't say that they didn't overlap. You were told earlier today that somehow her testimony could be interpreted to mean that she was saying, oh, no, 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 the only thing that happened, well, there was the gun kit, and then I stopped thinking about that, and then there was the gun that we purchased, and then, no, like anybody else, those things overlap. Those things can be happening simultaneously, but be completely separate from each other, be completely distinct purposes and thoughts and motivations. At the beginning of the case, the prosecution even contended that that whole big project in the backyard was a secret, something of a secret, not a joint project. There were questions suggesting that the landscapers were hired without Dan's consent, probably without even his knowledge. But the text messages show otherwise. And the testimony of James Denny and Tamara Oliva shows that that just isn't true. Both of them came in and told you, and James Denny gave just the most vivid, wonderful description of the way he worked out a piece with Dan Brophy and how completely a part of that planning Dan Brophy was, how integral to that planning he was. There's also the supposed secret about the gun show, the Expo Center, the gun that was purchased there. Nancy Brophy had become alarmed about crime, about shootings, about the rising levels of violence in society, about theft, intrusion, and become alarmed about a lot of things that involve personal safety. It all ran together for her, and she began to think that they were naive, that her whole lifelong aversion to having guns was perhaps now, at least in light of the way society had evolved, maybe that was a bad decision. Maybe she had missed something. She especially began to think that when she recognized that some of the good, capable people she knew and respected owned and even carried weapons for protection. She did worry about Dan's safety. She worried about her own. And Dan cared that she was concerned. He responded as you would expect a partner would. He talked it over with her, weighing the pros and cons, considering their options. He talked it over with his friend and colleague, Tanya Medlin. He talked it over with his friend and colleague, Tony Hall. And then he talked it over again with his wife. He knew that she was going to the Expo Center, and he would have been welcome to go with her. The gun they purchased was the make and model that Brett Glendenning, the man from the gun show, the then J&B employee, it was the same make and model that he recommended to them, and it turned out to be the same make and model that Tony Hall had thought would be a good choice. None of that was any secret to Dan. Nancy even discussed the purchase in advance with her mother-in-law and with Tanya Medlin. Now, having met both of them and knowing how fond they were of Dan and how much time they spent with Dan, if you were going to secretly buy a gun that you didn't want Dan Brophy to know about, the two people you would not tell would be Tanya Medlin and Karen Brophy. And then there's the slide. The slide was purchased, again, with a debit card in the name of Nancy Brophy from the On Point account, from that joint account. And it was shipped to the Brophy's home by the Postal Service with the seller requiring signature. It was a signature required delivery when the parcel was delivered. Now, when Kelsey Gway testified about the CSLI, she seemed to say that it could have been either one who could have taken delivery of the slide that day. And I think you have to check your notes. I'd not go back to the transcript to verify this, but I think she said that Nancy, in response to a question from us, that Nancy Brophy had never gotten as far as McMinnville that day, that she'd been somewhere around, closer to Beaverton and Hillsborough. And the implication, as I understood her testimony, was that either one could have signed for that slide. But Josiah Roloff came in with his own set of CSLI exhibits, and they clearly show that Nancy Brophy's phone was out as far as McMinnville that day, that she was in Sheridan and then she was in McMinnville, and that Dan Brophy's phone was home. Presumably he was home with it. His phone was home almost all day. And in this exhibit, you'll see that there's a time that one of the slides, and I think it might be page 7 of that exhibit. I don't have the exhibit number written down here, but it's the Josiah Roloff CSLI from February 28th, that Nancy Brophy appears to have been either in McMinnville still or just starting back to home at 2:56, which is about the time that they estimate that delivery occurred. And it appears really impossible from the work that he did that Nancy could have been the one who was home to sign for it that day. So the suggestions that you heard, and you heard them repeatedly, were not supported by actual evidence. Those were questions, those were insinuations, those were suggestions, but they were specious suggestions. They were not supported by evidence. Nancy Brophy did not hide all these things from her husband. She simply did not do that. And you have no evidence before you to think that she was sneaking around and behaving in that way in her marriage. Now, the standout example of deception in this trial, of course, was the decision to bring in Andrea Jacobs and present her to you. Duplicity come to life right here in this courtroom. She's as untrustworthy as a convicted criminal could be. She had the gall to impersonate an IRS agent. She showed up uninvited, willing to work uncompensated for Dr. Haney to help him improve his medical billing procedures. She feigned innocence when it came to any sort of benefit that she might get for this. She feigned a lack of knowledge of this significant legal trouble that she's in, that there's at least one active, perhaps more than one active criminal investigation headed her way. She even pretended to be somewhat disinterested in what benefit she might hope to receive when she agreed to talk to Detective Merrill in Texas before they brought her up here. She did admit to you, though, grudgingly, quite grudgingly, that he told her in Texas that it would be of benefit to her to share information about this case. And you know from our exhibit 430 that the Oregon Department of Justice, in fact, had already written a letter to her lawyer, and her lawyer had sent it to her, telling her, informing her that there was this new active investigation that was about to be prosecuted. You also know from an exhibit that I don't think you've seen yet, but you will have available to you in the jury room, that she's been convicted of the offenses described. She's been convicted of bank fraud, filing a false tax return, false impersonation of an employee of the United States, that would be the IRS agent, and aggravated identity theft. The only thing you can know with confidence about her is that she is so untrustworthy that the U.S. Department of Justice actually gave a federal prosecutor permission to come into this courtroom where another entity is prosecuting a woman for murder, gave her permission to come into this courtroom to testify against Andrea Jacobs. Donna Maddox, that prosecutor, that former federal prosecutor, told you that her opinion of Ms. Jacobs' truthfulness is that she's consistently untruthful. Patrick McCarthy, the doctor out in La Grande, told you that his opinion is that she's extraordinarily untruthful. Rhonda Slavic, the woman from California who lived and worked in Oregon for a period and actually hosted Ms. Jacobs in her home, she told you she's not capable of telling the truth. And Curtis Haney, when asked about his opinion of her truthfulness, said, she's a compulsive liar. It takes little imagination. Having seen the layout that Mr. Hersey showed you of the dorms in which they were held, that Andrea Jacobs either read a legal paper that Ms. Brophy had as we were preparing for an upcoming hearing with Mr. Howard, or she eavesdropped on Nancy Brophy as she talked with one of us on that professional phone you could see in the jail photographs, right out in the open, right out in the middle of where everybody else, the milieu in those jail pods. And keep in mind as you evaluate whether that's the most likely way she came up with this information, that the years, the months in which all of this would have happened, that they could have been housed together, were during the pandemic. And you can imagine that jail visits, professional jail visits, were few and far between during that time. It's possible that she both read some legal papers and she eavesdropped on some legal conversations, hoping to escape serving her full sentence for the fraud and deception. But from that, she constructed, she read, she overheard enough to construct a small story, and she could pretend Nancy Brophy told her herself. That never happened. Nancy Brophy never had that conversation with Andrea Jacobs. There was no conversation between the two of them about the distance of the muzzle from the shirt. None of that ever happened. And Andrea Jacobs is a liar, a person who would rather tell a lie than tell the truth. Let's review some of the other testimony that was unreliable. You were told that what happened at OCI the morning of June 2nd couldn't possibly have been a burglary, a robbery, some kind of theft, a property offense. Nothing was missing. You were told nothing at all was missing. You were told that by multiple witnesses affiliated with the state. But don't let it be lost on you that you were also told that Dan's red book bag, which he always had with him, wasn't ever recovered, that seemed to have gone missing. And who knows how much liquor, wine, or other attractive offerings inside of OCI might have been taken. You'll see when you get back into the jury room, this Exhibit 217 that we have up now in front of us. I want you to look carefully at that. You'll see that in sort of the upper left of the photo, there's an entire big tray. It's bigger even than a school lunch tray. It's probably 2 feet by 3 feet. And it appears to be filled with bottles of liquor, absolutely filled with bottles of liquor. And then if you look into the kitchen where Chef Damon was working, off to the right, just look through that narrow doorway, you'll see on the second shelf up from the ground, straight over it, there appears to be a whole nother big tray, the same size, equally filled with bottles of liquor. Now, Brian Wilkie and some of his colleagues from OCI told you that, well, that night, that afternoon, when the police finally left, when everybody finally left, they did an inventory. They went through OCI, and they figured out that nothing had been taken. Couldn't have been that. Couldn't have been that. But if you look at these photos, including the one that we have up right now, you'll see that has to be just a gross overstatement of what they did. They could not possibly have inventoried that place. They could not possibly have really gotten a handle on what might have been missing. And I would suggest specifically that liquor is something to pay attention to. We're going to come back to this in just a little bit, but from talking with the two detectives who headed this up, both Detective Posey and well, specifically Detective Merrill, and maybe Detective Posey did not support this, but Detective Merrill agreed that he had even taken a note after he talked to Oscar Taylor about that Oscar Taylor that morning had somewhere, Detective Merrill didn't think it was OCI, he thought maybe it was someplace else, but right in the same time frame that this happened, that Oscar Taylor said he'd taken Cabernet and a candle from someplace nearby. Don't underestimate how much of a motivator alcohol could be. And we just can't possibly know what other things would be of value, what other things could have been going on. But to say that there just absolutely was no evidence at all that something could have been taken is disingenuous. So there were some other things that Mr. Wilkie said while we're talking about him that I think are worth reviewing. He did seem to contradict Officer Wells, who told you that she hugged Nancy Brophy and cried with her while they were waiting for the detectives to be ready for Ms. Brophy's death notification in the RV. But Officer Wells told that story in a very credible way. She remembers breaking out into tears and that Nancy was crying. Mr. Wilkie also contradicted Nicole Barlow, the TIPS victim's assistance person who counseled Nancy Brophy right after she talked with the detectives. She said that she didn't meet Nancy Brophy right when she came in, but that she heard Nancy cry out, that she heard a wailing. And even Mr. Wilkie says, even though he contradicts them about her emotional response, he contradicts himself actually about her emotional response too, but even he agrees, contrary to what you've heard from the state again today, even he agrees that when Nancy Brophy got there, he immediately made a beeline for her. He says he held the tape up and he ushered her in. He was the first person to get to her. And that she said to him something to the effect of, "Oh, Brian, this doesn't look good." And he said, "It's not good, Nancy, it's not." Right off the bat. And then she walks over to Officer Wells, who starts crying with her and hugging her. She's clearly singled out. She's standing isolated with Officer Wells away from everybody else. I mean, what could she possibly think had happened? Of course she knew. Of course she knew. It could be that Nicole Barlow, when she heard her cry out, that she was hearing her immediate response to what Mr. Wilkie said. Now, I said that Mr. Wilkie contradicts himself on this point somewhat too. And that he came back in to tell you a second time that she didn't seem all that upset. But when he came in the first time, he told you that one of the other things he did that day to support Nancy Brophy, his good friend's wife, was that afterwards, the detectives were willing to let her drive herself home, and he intervened to say, "Oh, no, she's too upset. You drive her home. Detective, I'm tasking you with driving her home." But that seems, whether or not the detective got there on his own, and you have to imagine he did, I think that that's the more credible account from Mr. Wilkie about his perception of how Nancy Brophy was doing that day. So circling back to Detective Merrill for a second and Oscar Taylor, keep in mind that not only are there these very large trays of what appeared to have been, at least initially, full, I don't know what you call them, but like fifths or liters of alcohol, in pretty substantial quantity. But on top of that, there was testimony, I think, from Woody Bailey, and maybe also Tom Bethel, but Woody Bailey at least, about the fact that the restaurant that OCI was running did serve wine and beer. So that whole beautiful glassed-in restaurant space in the front, where the students would learn how to serve and learn how to, actually function like they were in a restaurant, kind of the graduation after they got through the live fire exercise, that was a functioning bar. So there was all sorts of this Cabernet. As Detective Merrill corrected Ms. Maxfield when she asked about this note about Cabernet and a candle. He said, "Oh, Cabernet Sauvignon and a candle." That's what it was. That's something that was right there in that restaurant, right there at OCI, along with the candles. Mr. Bailey told you that the table service that they had the students put on did involve candles. So we know that morning at OCI, Dan Brophy disarms the alarm at 7:22:30. And then we know from Ellen Levine, who lives in that condo building next door, that she walks her dog, and she always goes, but as I recall what she said, she always goes clockwise around the block. And it, takes longer some days than others because she lets the dog kind of wander and do what he wants to do. But that she's captured on video, from Sergio Perez, that I think it was the Bellagio's video, picked her up walking as she reapproached her building to go back in with her dog. And she's on that video at 8:15 a.m. So presumably she walked by the big door, the big open bay door at OCI sometime around 8:12 a.m., give or take a minute. Could have been even later than that. But she had a clear recollection that that door was open that morning. It was unusual to her to see the door open that late on her walk with her dog. She didn't at the time know that anything had happened, but her attention was immediately drawn back to it after she went grocery shopping with a friend and tried to get back to her condo, only to find out that the road was blocked. Now, I'm going to digress for just a moment here to tell you that Ellen Levine and the other people who lived in those condo buildings were never interviewed by the detectives. They weren't contacted. We found her. We found her just by canvassing the neighborhood and brought her in with that relatively important piece of information. But the people who were residents of, or staff, more importantly, the staff of the NARA Addiction Recovery Center that's right there in that same block as OCI, weren't interviewed. And the people from that condo building weren't interviewed. They were other than the surveillance video that was gathered by detectives, they had a specific purpose in going to businesses to get surveillance video. There was very, very little canvassing of the area that was done in the course of this investigation. But we know from Ellen Levine that that bay door is still open at, let's say, 8:12. Dan Brophy gets to work and undoes decodes the alarm that's on the regular door that's at the end of that long hallway. And he does that at 7:22:30. And then he does a whole bunch of things. You can see that he's done a bunch of things. Not only is the light on the coffee pot on, but he has in his pocket, the medical examiner agreed that he had 17 $1 bills in one pocket, and then he had, I think, $60 in the other pocket. Well, the 17 $1 bills would have been from that little pig, the cart in the student lounge where he had students put in money for the saffron and the other wonderful things that he had out for them to buy in small quantities, in small affordable quantities. And we know that he had done that it wasn't just that he randomly had 17 $1 bills in his pocket, but he had an IOU from a student in his pocket too. And so he'd taken the time to go maybe restock the cart, but he'd at least emptied the piggy bank and kind of checked out what was going on with it. He had gotten some of the stoves on. You can see that a number of things had been turned on. He was in the process of filling up the water part of the coffee pot. And in addition to that, you can see in the kitchen where his live fire event was going to occur that day, that there are a couple of big racks over in the corner of the room. And on those racks, there are some fresh products that wouldn't have been left out overnight. Some bags of rolls and some things that looked like the whole rack had been pulled out of that cooler in that big room over by the bay door. So we don't, of course, have a complete account of what Dan Brophy had done that morning before the intruder snuck in. But we do know, and I think Mr. Overstreet conceded as much in his description, that this all would have taken a few minutes, that some time had gone by after he disarmed the alarm before this intruder came in to shoot him. Now, the suggestion was that somehow that window of opportunity for a shooter closed right after they believe Nancy Brophy's van pulls out from the side of OCI and goes up Jefferson. And let me be clear about this when I say they say. We're not contesting that that van does appear to be Nancy Brophy's van, and it does appear to be Nancy Brophy driving it. We can look at those pictures just like the rest of you, just like her mother-in-law, and recognize that it appears that she was there. But we do take issue with that, I think, absurd, cartoonish animation that they gave you that shows a red vehicle that's parked right in front of OCI right at the opportune time. We do not believe that they have shown you any evidence that would establish that her vehicle was coming out from 17th onto Jefferson, let alone that it ever stopped in that area. So that we do take issue with. But the window of opportunity, I think, because of the timing of that animated thing and the timing of the video showing the Brophy van leaving on Jefferson, Mr. Overstreet seemed to be saying that that window could only have been another couple of minutes after Mr. Brophy had gotten to the point of starting the coffee and getting the ice water ready. And I believe if you go back and check your notes, you'll see that the testimony actually was that he disarms the alarm at 7:22:30, and then at about 7:33, there are people starting to congregate in the back parking lot. None of those people have gone inside the building, and it isn't until sometime between 7:33 and 7:35, and we don't have an exact time for it. There are a couple different ways you could look at it, but it seems to be somewhere in that window of 7:33 to 7:35 that his colleague, Chef Damon, gets off the bus. She can be seen walking down Jefferson and then would have gotten into the building. So that window of opportunity is wider, I think, than is being described to you. But the window of opportunity that would have existed then for this idea that somehow Nancy Brophy had stopped, she just happened to be right there and had stopped and had gotten out and gotten into the building, that window of opportunity would have been very, very narrow when you look at the number of things that he had already accomplished that morning. And it's actually hard to imagine that unless he was running, that he could have gotten from his truck inside and done all of the things that had been done in OCI in time for her to then be seen a block away driving away at 7:28. Because the time between where she's seen down the block driving away and the time of the alarm stamp is 4.5 minutes. But you have to take some time off of that too, because if they were right, it would have taken some time to get back into the car and for her to drive away. So look at those numbers carefully before you decide that she really had the opportunity to do that. There is no evidence that she was on 17th, let alone that she was parked in front of OCI, and the timing just does not add up the way you're told it does. So we do know that there were a number of other people there who were behaving suspiciously. You saw the videos. You saw the man who was walking at a fast clip following the other man, and he was walking directly toward that intersection right there. He was on the OCI side of the street. He was on the north side of Jefferson, walking toward 17th, very, very shortly before Dan Brophy would have arrived. You saw the other people who were behaving in kind of an odd way, pacing back and forth. One of them looked kind of like a lookout. But the person of most concern, and we don't have proof that he had a gun that day. It isn't our job to investigate. We had no opportunity to investigate these things the way the detectives did. But the person that you do need to pay attention to when they talk about Nancy Brophy was the only person who had the opportunity to do this, she's the only one there, that's simply not true. They went to great lengths to lead you to believe, and the detectives told you Oscar Taylor had left the area until challenged about that. But Sergio Perez, who'd spent a lot of time poring over that video, was able to piece together fragments of videos from different businesses to show that, oh no, he hadn't left the area at all. No, no, no. What happened was that exactly as Dan Brophy is driving down Madison, exactly at the same time that he cuts off of Jefferson back to Madison and he's come down to the back of OCI, exactly that time, Oscar Taylor has turned the corner from Jefferson onto 18th, and he's walking toward that intersection of 18th and Madison that Dan Brophy's about to drive through. And then, and this too came out very grudgingly. It took a lot of extra witnesses coming in to try to piece this together. But then it turns out that those students who are waiting to be let into OCI in the back of the school, that those students actually see a man who fits Oscar Taylor's description. He's right there at OCI. And he does have a record. He does have a record for reacting violently. The state can minimize it and say that a lot of those things are really his attempts to steal things and get away with it, and that they're not aware of a time that he ever used a weapon in doing that. We didn't go through a thorough examination of his record, so I guess we don't know all of that. But he has a history, even by the state's own admission to you today, of reacting violently, reacting badly when confronted about the fact that he's taking other people's property. So why didn't they find Oscar Taylor? He was known to them. They said they recognized him when they saw him a couple days later in Gresham or outer Northeast Portland. Why didn't they go find him? Why didn't they find out if he had a gun that day? Why didn't they learn a little bit more about what was actually going on? Why didn't they survey more people in the neighborhood? Figure out whether he had been more of a problem. So at that point in time, this was essentially an investigation that Detective Posey was heading, although Detective Merrill clearly has taken it over more recently. So it's really on his shoulders that the responsibility falls for failing to find out whether a suspect's DNA might have been present on those spent cartridge casings. Detective Posey is the one who gave the order to superglue both of the casings so that fingerprint analysis could be run. Now, you heard from criminalist Willard, who's since retired, that in her entire 30-year career at PPB, that superglue to try to get fingerprints thing had never worked once. Not a single time that she tried to do that had that been done successfully. So the state can say, well, the incidence, the success rate of getting usable DNA off of a spent cartridge is low, and we didn't think that was worth doing. But it's not as low as 0. You heard from Karen Lawless what the science is, and that science was already known in 2018. In fact, one of the other things that came out of Detective Merrill's notes that he was questioned about was whether he hadn't had a meeting with the two prosecutors, the two lead prosecutors here, shortly before Ms. Brophy was arrested, and whether they hadn't asked whether that DNA testing could be done on the casings to try to get some insight into what had happened, how Dan Brophy had been shot, and who had been involved in it. There were some other things that just were not diligently investigated that are of enough concern to mention. There was that book that was lying out on the bench seat of Dan Brophy's truck the morning he was killed. And Detective Posey said that he took that photograph of the book and the other things that were sitting out on the truck seat. But apparently he wasn't curious about what that book might signify about Dan Brophy and his apparent interest in psilocybin or psychedelics, the subject of the book, an interest that even his son Nathaniel confirmed. He told you that the two of them went to some sort of seminar or presentation out of town, and that was a subject of great interest. You could tell from Mr. Wilkie's presentation the first time he was here that that was a subject of some interest to him as well. Detective Posey also didn't follow up with Nancy Brophy, not even once, after that phone call on June 6th. It seemed that his goal in that call, maybe he had tandem goals, but one of his goals, at least in that call, seemed to be to try to trick her into thinking that her husband had been having an affair. That he was already thinking along the lines of trying to sow discord, as raw as those days must have been for her. It didn't work. She responded to that ploy with maturity and grace. But that was the very last conversation he ever had with her until she was arrested. He assumed that she was guilty because he saw on video that she was in the neighborhood near the time that her husband was killed. The possibility that she could have been an OCI was enough for him. He assumed she was guilty because they owned a gun and a slide. The possibility that that could have been used was enough, even though that decidedly was not proven to you. And then his partner, Detective Merrill, who told you he was 100% positive her van turned that corner from OCI onto Jefferson. He had to look at the video 100 times to be sure, but in the end, he assured you he was positive. After looking at that video 100 times, he was 100% positive he could see her van turn onto Jefferson in that solitary, very, very grainy video clip. He was so sure of that he directed Csli Records, the technician, to create that animation. He created that. He had her create that so that you could see what he was imagining. You could see more clearly what he's so certain he could see in that video after watching it 100 times. That video is not evidence. I mean, that animated video, that whole montage that they put together for you is not evidence. It's Detective Merrill's imagination of what the video might show, if only everything had happened the way he imagined it happened. And keep in mind that even Csli Records, who created that montage, agreed that seeing a glint of light in the video, what Detective Merrill takes to be the van, isn't the same thing as seeing the van itself. As she concurred, there are plenty of other things that could cause a quick glint of light in the camera at that moment. So Detective Merrill also is the person, circling back to Oscar Taylor and the conversation about these other men who were approaching, all of them, last seen walking in the direction of OCI and that open bay door. Detective Merrill also told you, and told Ms. Maxfield in response to questioning, that the people who were living without housing in downtown Portland, a population that had spilled over into Goose Hollow by that time and was fairly well established by 2018, that entire, just generalizing for the whole population, he said, no, they only fight with hands and feet and fists. The gun violence is rare. He suggested that it was almost non-existent. So let's talk a little bit more about the gun evidence that was presented to you. The zip-tied slide that's out of battery. You've heard a lot about that, as if somehow that dispositively proves that slide had been removed and replaced on the morning of June 2nd. There's nothing about the way that slide is seated that tells you anything about what was done, or the way that slide is seated on that gun that tells you anything about how that was used or handled or manipulated, or when it was last used or handled or manipulated. That proves nothing. The slide was removed from the receiver. The receiver is that lower part of the gun. It was removed from the receiver at the gun show. Brett Glendenning and his colleagues showed Ms. Brophy. He told you and she told you that they showed her how to properly maintain and clean the gun. He also told you, importantly, that having that zip tie in there will cause it to misseat. And if I understood him correctly, if you put the zip tie in after it's already in the proper position, you can get the zip tie in. But if you've got a zip tie in it and then you try to put it back on, it will misseat. It'll misseat every time. The zip tie is enough to keep it from sitting where it should sit. Now, he and one of the detectives, I think, mentioned that typically it'll misseat backwards, the way Mr. Overstreet was showing it to you this morning, that you won't be able to get it completely flush in the back and the slide will be back a little bit rather than forward. But obviously it can misseat forward too, or it wouldn't have been in that condition when the detectives found it. but it doesn't tell you that she had changed the slide or done what they think she did that morning. It just means that the slide had been removed some point, it had a zip tie in it, and it didn't get back on the gun right. That could have happened, how many days were there in between? Or at least 100 different days that could have happened. And what Ms. Brophy told you from the beginning is when they got that gun home, she got it home from the gun show, she and Dan Brophy looked at it that evening, and they were, kind of not sure exactly what to do with it, and had some conversations about what next steps they should take and what the right thing to do was. And she got as far as trying to do what Mr. Glendenning had showed her, part of it, and then was just sort of like, this is going to have to wait for people who understand this better to walk us through this, because this is just, it's not, kind of over my head. It's not my thing. Nothing.
I don't mean to interrupt. Is this a convenient time to take a pause, or would you prefer a few more minutes and then we take a pause?
Actually, this will work.
Okay,
That's good.
all right,
Thanks.
let's take our afternoon break now and be back on the record at 4. All right, please be seated. And Ms. Weinmiller, when you're ready.
I lost track of a couple of slides earlier and knew I had, now I figured out what they were, so let me digress back to that microphone. How's that? Better? Okay. All right. I'd earlier lost track of a couple of slides and I knew I did it, but now I found them. So let me go back to talking about that window of opportunity. And I think I should correct myself. It appears it's 5 minutes and 30 seconds, not 4 minutes and 30 seconds. But in that time, Dan Brophy had to make 2 separate trips out to his truck, out to the corner of Southwest 17th where he was parked to unload the carts. And there are carts that you can see in Exhibit 216 there that have the pig in them. But it's unlikely, given the size of those carts, that he could roll 2 of them at the same time. But there are 2 that are present in those photos that you'll see. He had to empty that little piggy bank that you can see in this one, and there's a better photo of it later, but he had to get the money out of that pig, including this IOU that you can see here. This is one of the things that was in his pocket that the medical examiner found. There are the $1 bills. He had to go back into that large, deep storage room, get into the cooler, and then roll out that big rack that has the perishable ingredients on it. And that you can see in the corner of this kitchen, and this is the kitchen that his class was gonna be working in for live fire that day. And then the ventilation, the lights, and then start the process of getting the coffee and the water going. So clearly that's something that would take several minutes and may well have taken that entire 5 minutes and 30 seconds. And remember, it's not a full 5 minutes and 30 seconds because that timestamp is when the van is seen a block away driving west on Jefferson. So now let me go back to where I was. All right, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the CSLI records. Next. So you heard from Delilah Marvell and from Nancy Brophy that there was a party out at their place, at the Marvells, at their woodland acreage in the summer of 2016. And that after that, Nancy and Dan Brophy realized that that area around Gales Creek, which is the general vicinity in which they have their land, out toward Vernonia, that entire part of the county just inside the coastal range would have everything that they desired. It had great access to Highway 26, which, as you all know, in the winter is a pretty reliable highway. It's wide and it's relatively safe, certainly much safer than some of the other highways that you can take coming back into Portland from the west. The coast is only about 40 minutes beyond that. It's flat, rich farmland. Until you get up into the coastal range, there's just some beautiful farmland out there with the Nehalem River running through it. You can get land at a good price. It's still a relatively inexpensive part of the city, or of the state, especially given in its proximity to Portland. It's definitely less expensive than getting into Yamhill County and Pinot Country, or getting too close to Hillsborough. It was a place that they could afford, a place that was close enough for them to stay connected to family and friends. Now, Nancy Brophy can't now tell you which days she went out there or where exactly she went. She can just tell you that after they went out to that party and she saw Dan light up, saw how much what did he tell Delilah Marvell, you're living the life? That he was so happy that she thought, okay, this is the ticket. This is probably what we should really hone in on. And so she would explore. She'd just drive around, as she loved to do, get lost in her thoughts. And there are plenty of small roads that etch that area before you get into the Tillamook State Forest. The fact that that public shooting range is in the Tillamook Forest does not tell you whether that the tower that Ms. Gway and Mr. Roloff were testifying about is in the Tillamook Forest. The tower, as you can see, is quite some ways before And you can tell that even though the elevation is starting to pick up there, there is absolutely no reason to believe, and I suggest to you that it's not true, that the tower itself is in the Tillamook State Forest just because the shooting range is. Ms. Brophy can't tell you for sure when she went to Vernonia, and she can't even tell you for sure that's what she was doing March 26th and 27th, because she doesn't know. She has not focused. She had no reason to focus on those days until just very, very recently. But her explanation for why she might have been meandering in that area makes a lot of sense. That would have been a wonderful, wonderful place for them to live. Ms. Guay also told you when she was here this last time that she made no attempt to ascertain how many times Nancy Brophy drove through those small towns outside of Vernonia. She was asked to focus specifically on the towers that were in Vernonia that would show that she got basically either into Vernonia or just short of it, but that she didn't look at all the many other towers that dot that area to find out whether Ms. Brophy had been driving around looking at properties and just sort of brainstorming about places that would work in those months. But she did tell you that what she looked at were records that only went from November of 2017 through June of 2018, and the Marvell's party had been a full, almost a year and a half earlier in the summer of 2016. So there was a lot of territory there to cover, and there was a lot of time to cover, many, many months that were just outside of the analysis that she was able to testify to you about. And in fact, she told you that she had at one point been asked to look to see what towers were closer to one of those other locations. I think maybe it was a Gales Creek location. I don't remember exactly what it was. She'd been asked to figure out whether there was a tower she could search or she could check against the records, but then there was no follow through and she was never asked to actually look at it. So you have very, very little information to support this contention that Ms. Brophy wasn't driving in that area doing exactly what she told you she was doing. And in fact, it makes more sense that she was doing exactly that. Because what Detective Merrill hypothesized, and even today, Mr. Overstreet said, as he was talking about this CSLI demonstration, that this idea that on March 27th, Ms. Brophy had gotten all the way out to that gun range and somehow learned to fire a gun. So even his own admission, his sort of self-deprecating comment was, we got a little crazy with it. Detective Merrill and I got a little crazy with that. But then he doubled down and said he still thinks that's what happened, as crazy as that description was. It was cartoonishly crazy. It was ridiculous. That his hypothesis is that because that's the one time they can find Nancy Brophy's cell phone anywhere in the vicinity of that range, that what must have happened that day is that she raced from her home in Beaverton in her Toyota Sienna. She gets all the way out to North Fork Wolf Creek Public Range. She gets to the turnoff from Highway 26. She passes that tower, the one in question, and then she turns off Highway 26. So she has to get from the tower to the turnoff on 26. And then she has to drive down North Fork Wolf Creek Road, which you can see up there. 26 is the one that comes down at an angle across the lower right of the screen. And then as Mr. Roloff described, Mr. Stringer described to you, the intersection is actually back a little bit. But she had to get that far down the highway before she turned off on this obviously small gravel road that snakes through the woodlands there up in the mountains. He had to drive all the way down that winding road to get to the public range. And Mr. Stringer told you that when he did that recently, even to get to the very first of those 4 ranges took him about 6 minutes. So let's say it's 5 minutes down 26 and then 6 minutes up to that range. What I believe Kelsey Guay and Josiah Roloff agreed on is that the CSLI data suggests that that time that she was past that tower, that she got into that vector that was pointing, generally toward the range or covered that space that included the range, that would have been 25 minutes, approximately 25 minutes. So if you assume, then that's a round trip, right? She's got to go 5 miles or, 5 minutes down 26 and 6 minutes up into the woods. And then she's got to double that back. That's 22 minutes right there of drive time. That gives her like 3 minutes to find the range, figure out what to do, get out of the car. If there's somebody else shooting, to tell them, please, please, would you mind stop shooting? Because I'd like to go put up a target for myself. I have to run down the range and I don't want you to shoot me while I'm doing that. And then she figures out how to get the clips into the gun and fires off all these shots. And presumably, because she actually wants to know now, I mean, indulge me because I know this does sound crazy, but she wants to know whether she's learned to shoot well enough that she can stop practicing. She's got this nailed. She runs down to check the target again, and then she runs back to her car and shoots back down the road. And before long, she's in Northeast Portland having coffee or lunch with a friend. I mean, it's absurd to think that she's done all this planning, she's done all this preparation, and that's what she does to learn how to shoot. It's absurd. Maybe as a matter of physics that's possible, but as a matter of common sense, it's not. It makes much, much more sense that she was exploring the area that she hoped to inhabit before too long. So besides the fact that the evidence relating to the gun is just horribly insufficient to support a conviction, we've got no evidence that she could have accomplished the shots that killed her husband with that kind of incredible precision. I mean, remember what the medical examiner told you about that. Severed his spine, his aorta, his heart, a lung, and that's just one of the shots. And then the other one manages to take a parallel track going back the other direction. Again, goes through his heart. I mean, that's amazing, amazing precision. And there is no evidence that's presented to you that those were close range shots. They certainly were not. The medical examiner told you there was nothing in terms of damage to the skin or to the body that indicated that those were, such literally point blank shots that sort of precision would be, perhaps imaginable. No, those shots were taken by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing, and they didn't learn how to do it by racing up to the North Fork Wolf Creek Range and firing shots off in 3 minutes on a cold spring morning and then hopping back into the car. So besides that insufficient evidence relating to guns and her ability to use a gun that capably, that incredibly capably, you heard all sorts of other conflicting accounts about her ability and her capability when it came to planning. Nancy Management Brophy is so organized that she planned a murder for months, and yet she forgot to drive to the scene incognito in a vehicle that wouldn't be recognized. No, she took the van that her in-laws had given her. She's so organized that she forgot to check for nearby cameras. Never occurred to her, with all the writing that she'd been doing in this sort of mystery suspense genre that she was in, romance writing, never occurred to her that there might be surveillance cameras, like maybe along the TriMet line that Jefferson follows right there. Nope. Didn't notice those cameras over on the PPB building across the street. Just didn't even occur to her that surveillance might have been a problem. So there she goes, driving a van that's clearly distinguishable. She's so organized, Nancy Management Brophy, that she overlooked how much safer and easier it might have been to accomplish this goal another way. Maybe while mushroom hunting in the woods, maybe on any number of other occasions. If you accept the state's hypothesis, totally unsupported by evidence again, that she actually was aware of the comp benefit, that somehow that would be helpful. Mushroom hunting in the woods is something he did for work sometimes. But no, she went to a place where she had been going regularly for years, that she even went for fun, for lunch with friends. A place where everybody knew her, where she was well recognized, driving a well-recognized van. And her deliberate planning went on for months and months, but she couldn't be bothered to wait the 5 more months it would have taken for that most valuable of the life insurance policies, that accidental death policy, to pass out of its contestability period. That would have happened in November of that year, but no, she just couldn't wait until November. Apparently now The suggestion is that that's somehow related to the fact that Dan was going to go back to teaching days, but certainly at some point he would have gone back to teaching weekends. But gosh, that was only $250,000. Why wait for that? She's motivated by insurance. She didn't care about the most valuable properties. And she knew that she could hide the purchase of the slide that she purchased on eBay if she just went back to the gun show. These gun shows apparently are happening once a month or once every 2 months or with some frequency that kind of surprised me, but she could have easily gotten back to a gun show, paid cash for the slide, didn't have to register it because that's not an operable gun. That's not a piece that has to be registered. There's no background check. Could have just paid cash for that. But instead, she opted not just to purchase it on eBay, but out of the same joint account with her husband, the On Point account. So there are a couple of other aspects of the CSLI that I think are just important to touch on briefly, but one is this idea that she had abandoned her husband's family. I understand where that came from, and I think that that was said to you in complete sincerity. But I do want you, I'm not going to play them for you now, I'm not going to put them up because you're going to get the unredacted versions, not the ones that we were looking at in court where we were trying to disguise the phone numbers. But you'll have the versions that actually have all that data in them. But look at the frequency of those contacts. Look at the frequency of those visits back and forth. They were in good contact that summer. They talked more than once a day. And that was going on, even though she's spending all that time in Texas. She's got all these other things going on and all the people in her family who are, wanting and needing attention to work out those details and deal with their own pain. But she still was every bit as connected to Karen and Jack Brophy as she ever had been. And she had good contact with Nathaniel as well. So, a failure of memory, inadvertent, nothing to blame anybody for. It happens. It happens more and more as we age. So, let's talk about memory. Of everything you heard about memory, and there was a lot being thrown at you, a lot of different conditions, a lot of different explanations, but the two that matter from our perspective, the only two that matter, are this concept of not attending that Dr. Riesberg talked with you about, and retrograde amnesia. We're not at all worried about anterograde amnesia, except the fact that I sometimes have trouble pronouncing it correctly, but that has nothing to do with this. That's memory going forward from whatever the shocking event is, and we're not talking about that. We're talking about retrograde amnesia, which means that a period of time immediately preceding the event gets wiped out, or at least partially wiped out. So retrograde amnesia and not attending are the two important concepts. And I'm going to ignore almost all of the rest of those, except that I just want to say clearly, disassociation and PTSD and the kinds of trauma therapies that Dr. Best was talking with you about that relate to PTSD, none of those are, to us, those are red herrings. Those are confusing the situation. And it's important to keep in mind that when the state criticizes the frequency with which these amnesia defenses come up, to understand that the vast majority of those are about like alcoholic blackouts or things that have nothing to do with this case. None of the blackout phenomenon, which of course does come up in a million different criminal cases for understandable reasons, disassociation, PTSD, none of those things have anything to do with what occurred here. What Dr. Riesberg was describing to you are those two concepts or two phenomena, two things that science has recognized do happen, of not attending and retrograde amnesia. Now, of the two of them, not attending is a fairly common thing. It really just means that you are concentrating so much on something that's important to you that you're trying to accomplish it, that you kind of, it's like you've got blinders on. You sort of lose track of everything else around you. And unless something really draws your attention, pulls you out of your reverie or this very high concentration state that you're in, you don't notice what's going on. And we all do that. I mean, to varying degrees, we all do that. In fact, that probably is what explains why Chef Damon didn't notice that morning that she was in the building with Dan Brophy for that long period of time. I just didn't pick up on the fact that they'd never exchanged pleasantries. She never crossed it in the hall. You know, that you look at the layout of that building and you know you're going to run into other people if they're in the building with some frequency, because there's that one central hallway that goes down. But, you know, she didn't notice that. She even, when she found the door open at what must have been at least 8:12 or so in the morning, that big bay door, she thinks that's weird, but she doesn't think, well, I should find Dan and ask him why he didn't close it. And then she gets to the back door to let the students into the student lounge. And again, she's just kind of like, I wonder why he didn't let him in. Doesn't go to find him because she was concentrating. She had her own class to teach and she was really, really focused on it. And so she was not attending. She was not paying attention to all of these other details and the potential significance of them. And I'm sure she felt horribly about that afterwards, but it's not something she should feel badly about, because we all do it. We all do it in varying degrees, and there are varying things that cause us to give something that much attention that we tune everything else out. But what Dr. Riesberg was explaining to you about that is, if you're not paying attention, if you're not attending to other details, they're not getting into your mind. They're not getting into your memory. You may actually not have noticed all these things, and so it wouldn't be later that you could give a perfectly complete account of everything that had been happening around you while you were not attending. If your concentration is narrow enough and focused enough, you really have just lost all of that. You never took it in. And that's important in this context, understanding what probably was happening with Nancy Brophy that morning. So retrograde amnesia, which would have then occurred later, the not attending period, would have been the time that she's thinking about this book, this trilogy. She's not gotten a great night's sleep. She's really been excited about this, but she's kind of been on overdrive excited about it now for almost a week. And then she goes down there and she's trying to work out some of these details so she can get this all onto paper and off to the agent, who then is going to present it to the publisher. And she's just focused as all get out on that. And then this horrible thing happens. And it is life-changing. It is absolutely life-changing for her. It is probably the worst thing that will ever happen to her. It's the kind of shock that most people don't experience in a lifetime, because most of us do have the opportunity to come to terms with the passing of a loved one. Very, very rarely does that happen in such a sudden and such a horrific way. So the pieces of that, and let me go back to the not attending, well, no, I'll come back to that in a minute. So the pieces of that are so important to understand are that there are three factors that were described to you by Dr. Warford and Dr. Riesberg. It has to be extremely sudden. It has to be wholly unexpected. And it has to be very consequential and uncontrollable, right? And I think Dr. Warford used a term like negative valence, and Dr. Riesberg may have said that as well. But what they're talking about is just that the negative quality of what you have just learned, what has just happened, is so high and it's so uncontrollable and it was so unforeseeable that it causes a level of distress, a reaction that is very, very rare. And thank God it's rare. I mean, can you imagine if that sort of thing happened on with any frequency at all? But it takes that constellation of circumstances to cause retrograde amnesia. And when that happens, it's a failure of the brain to even capture and encode the memories of the events that occur shortly before that loss is recognized. It doesn't matter, of course, when it doesn't matter, for instance, in this case, when Dan Brophy was killed, that's not the operative time frame. The operative time frame is when she realizes that it's happened, right? So the brain as both Dr. Riesberg and Dr. Warford explained, there's a biochemical process and there's a mechanism at work that causes this. And essentially, in very simplistic terms, and I'm not nearly as eloquent as Dr. Riesberg, I know, but in very simplistic terms, the brain's flooded with adrenaline. It is so horrific. And that's, that's of course what gives us this flight or fight response, right? I mean, it's something that is released in a very, very emergent situation. And that adrenaline flood is so extreme that the body then responds to it by saying, whoa, this is, you need to calm down. This is chemically, this is really too much for the body. And so then cortisol washes over and takes over and tries to control the adrenaline. At least this is how I understood what he was explaining to you. And that combination of things so thoroughly permeates the brain that the brain doesn't actually retain and then encode those memories. And they described how there are a couple of different stages of memory, and it can interrupt all of those, but there's a chance that it even interrupts before it gets into short-term memory. That it's not just a disruption that occurs between short-term and long-term memory, but that it can be very immediate. So what Dr. Riesberg was explaining in terms of the general phenomena is that if you take the overlay of somebody who was not being very attentive because they had this very high degree of concentration to begin with, and they hadn't taken in everything that was going on, Ms. Brophy testified that one of the things she does remember from that morning, and she thinks it was that morning, she thinks this is an accurate memory from that morning, but one of the things she does remember is that there was a man working on a white car or a white vehicle that was near her, and at first, she didn't even notice that he was there, but after a while she started thinking, and something about him is making me uncomfortable. And so she moved. Dr. Riesberg explained that those kinds of things that can break through your concentration are the bits of memory, those kind of, postcards, little pieces of memory that are most likely to come in because they were significant enough to break through the concentration. And that, I would suggest to you, is also consistent with that whole series of calls then that she has later when she gets home. And as she's gotten the dogs, we'll go back to that in a minute, but she gets home and she's working on her computer, and then she gets that first call from Maxine Borcherding. And then Mr. Hively explained to you the whole back and forth, the lengthy calls that she's having with her. It clearly has both of their attention because they're on the phone back and forth nonstop during that period. And then she has a call with Karen Brophy. They're both alarmed. My recollection is that second call with Karen Brophy, the actual connection with Karen Brophy happens at OCI, not immediately afterwards at the house, but these women are all really worried about Dan. They're very alarmed. And so she does remember that series of events too before she gets down to OCI, but it's only those really, for lack of a better term, those alarming pieces of what happened that morning that jump out more clearly than everything else. Now, when Mr. Overstreet was talking with Ms. Brophy as she was testifying, he was trying to get her to give him more detail about what had happened. I think somehow thought maybe her memory could be refreshed and she would be able to fill in more of those blanks, or maybe he was just cynical and didn't believe that she was unable to fill them in. But as he pushed her and he pushed her and he pushed her, you'll notice that, and this happened in particular on the second day she was testifying, but when he pushed her and pushed her and pushed her, she started to acquiesce to what he was suggesting. She didn't always acquiesce, but she got to the point of exhaustion, and you could tell that she wasn't able to give him answers, but if she didn't know the real answer, she would agree with what he was suggesting had happened, that she would actually let him help her fill in some of those blanks with information that he was giving her. Now, she told you, remember, she's about to turn 72, that she's been getting up at 4:30 every morning that we've been here. So she's probably finding this experience even more taxing and even more exhausting physically than all of the rest of us are. But she gets up at 4:30 every morning and she comes here. And she is attentive. She does her very best. But that testimony took a day and a half, nonstop day and a half. And her mind did start to wander as she went further into it. But one of the examples that I want you to focus on of whether what she was saying, everything that she was saying was a real memory, whether it was accurate or whether she was just trying to give answers to questions, trying to fill in information that she didn't really know, had to do with that same CSLI that we were just talking about out near the North Fork Wolf Creek Range. Mr. Overstreet asked her when he was questioning her to agree that she had watched a video that morning of March 26th. He asked her specifically about March 26th, whether she'd watched a video about how to load a Glock that very morning before she drove out there, suggesting that she wanted to learn how to load the Glock that morning, and then she was going to go out to the gun range and use that newly acquired knowledge. Now, when Officer Sparling had testified some time ago, he told you there was some evidence she had watched such a video that morning. He did admit on cross-examination that it appeared that it had not been lengthy at all. In fact, I think he even conceded on cross-examination, although this wasn't drawn out, as I recall, on direct, that it had probably been just a second or two. It was a very, very short amount of time. But that's in the State's Exhibit 82. Now, Mr. Roloff had come in just, I think, 5 days before Ms. Brophy testified, and he had talked with you. He had testified about that same thing, and he had put together for us our Exhibit 339, which was responsive to State's Exhibit 82. And he did a number of things. He went back and looked for the videos that are listed on State's 82, but that Officer Sparling said he had not retrieved, he hadn't tried to look at. And we played those for you because we thought a lot of them were much more innocuous in the viewing than the name might suggest. You know, that there was this kind of fear-mongering quality to telling you that she'd looked at the videos, but the one that she'd watched for the longest period of time was basically a historical video about Glocks. Had nothing to do with how you might use one to actually shoot it. So Mr. Roloff, in the course of that testimony, also went through that that portion of State's Exhibit 82 where the suggestion had been made to you in the initial testimony that she had watched this video about how to load a Glock. Now, I agree with Mr. Overstreet that at some point that video must have been on the computer, or at least there must have been some brief link to it. We don't know that. You don't have any evidence about that, whether it was actually watched in whole. But what Mr. Roloff had told you just days before Ms. Brophy testified is that it had literally, there'd been dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of bookmarks or things, activity on the computer that had all synchronized up all in a row. And it's 10:13, I don't remember exactly what it is. I think it's 10:13, 35 seconds and 10:13, 36 seconds. And on our Exhibit 339, if you look at pages 3, 4, 5, and 6, you'll see on page 3 this video that he was asking Ms. Brophy about watching, about loading a Glock. You'll see that video, but you'll see that it's high up in the string of all this activity that happens within 1 second. So we all knew, except for Ms. Brophy, we all knew she hadn't actually watched that video on March 26th, that that was something the computer did all on its own. And yet, when asked about it, when he asked her to agree that she'd watched the video, she was just sort of like, yeah, I guess if you say so. In that acquiescence, that filling things in is something that happens when somebody doesn't have a memory. It's a natural tendency, but it doesn't mean that the information that the person is giving you is accurate. It also doesn't mean that the information that the person is giving you is untrustworthy for some reason that has to do with lying, right? We all know that there's a big difference between purposefully telling a lie and doing the very best you can with the information available to you to replace a memory to come up with an answer to a question. That's a natural human tendency. That's how the brain works. We try to be helpful. We try to use information at our disposal to try to provide answers, and that's what Ms. Brophy does. As many of you will remember, Donald Rumsfeld once famously explained that there are the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. There are the known knowns, there are the things we know we know. We also know there are the known unknowns. That is to say, we know, I can't do a perfect Rumsfeld imitation, I'm sorry. That is to say, we know that there are some things we do not know, but there are also the unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know. It is the latter category that tends to be so difficult. Now, he offered this in the cusp, as an explanation on the cusp of our invading Iraq in 2002, but I mention it in this context because it does offer a framework for thinking through what you've learned about memory, what you know about memory from your own experiences. There is no question, and Dr. Riesberg told you this, but that an extremely sudden, a wholly unexpected, and a very consequential and uncontrollable loss can cause retrograde amnesia. And that's a failure of the brain to capture and encode memory of events that occurred shortly before the loss was recognized. The best a person can do is to try to fill in the blanks. There is no therapy for that. There is no chemical, there's no pharmaceutical therapy that can be used that can try to recreate those memories. The best a person can do is try to fill in the blanks. And I say this with great fondness, but Nancy Brophy is a person who will fill in the blanks. She's a chatterer. That's how her brain works. She is always, always, always filling in the blanks. She will fill that in with words. And you saw that on full display here in the courtroom. The more exhausted she became, the more words filled the space. So there were times that her responses were obviously speculative. She admitted to things, that inculpatory fact, that more accurately, that supposed inculpatory fact, because it wasn't an accurate fact, that she had watched this video, but it was demonstrably untrue. The only point at which she stopped accepting all those facts that were being handed to her really was when she was asked whether she went inside OCI. And then her response in substance was, I cannot imagine that because I cannot imagine that I would have killed my husband. That's just unfathomable. One of our known knowns, or our known unknowns, is how the stress of living in jail has impacted her ability to recall and relate information in her memory banks. It's hard to tell how much she could have accessed 4 years ago, before the sudden loss of her husband, before she was thrown in jail. We also don't know where she is in the process that we're all going through, that none of us really recognize well, but that we all go through with the gradual decrease and diminishment of memory over time. She'll be 72 this month. She's well into the age that even somebody with high acuity may be suffering or starting to experience some imperceptible decreases in memory. There's no question she's a person of high acuity. She obviously is. She's got great social talents. There's no doubt about that. But do those things make her infallible? Does that mean that she can withstand the rigors of what she's been going through for the last 4 years, certainly for the last couple of months? We do have some known knowns, though, about that morning, thanks to the digital forensic experts, both Arthur Hively and Josiah Roloff. We know that she turned on her laptop at 8:31 a.m. It promptly crashed and then rebooted. And then she was able to work on insurance business for a few moments. Oops. You'll see in the exhibits that you have back with you, the defense exhibits 370 and 372 are exhibits from Mr. Hively that show her working on that insurance business after 8:31 in the morning. And they show fairly consistent nonstop activity. And then she turns to her writing. She turns to that Witches trilogy that she'd been so fixated on for that week, that she was racing to finish. And in Defense Exhibit 373, he shows you the proof that that's what she's doing on her computer, that there's a Lexar thumb drive that's plugged in, and then she's working on that for quite some time. She's doing that all in response to the email from the agent that you saw from May 25th. That's Defense Exhibit 209. And you'll have an index to all the exhibits, so it should be pretty easy to find these things. But those all tie together, and they presented all of that evidence to you. And then Mr. Roloff and Mr. Hively both talked with you about the series of phone calls that we've now gone over between Maxime Borcherding and Nancy Brophy, and then Nancy Brophy and Karen Brophy, and then the call from the friend who wants to see whether they can have lunch. All of those things happen in very rapid succession right before she goes down to OCI to talk with the detectives. And so from that, we know now that even though the questioning to Heidi Hutchinson when she testified suggested that she must have been wrong about her timing, and that the detectives who wrote it down as that she must have run into Nancy Brophy sometime after 9 o'clock, that's what she said initially. She said, no, I have a clear memory of this. My daughter had sports practice that morning, and we would have gotten home from that sometime around 7:45 or 7:50 that morning, and we saw Nancy not very long after that. It was right about the time we got home. She must have been right about that, because Mr. Hively tells you that by 8:30, so 45 minutes later, less than 45 minutes later, she's already on her computer. She's already doing work. So she must have succeeded in finding the dogs and gotten them home during that time between 7:45 and 8:30 in the morning. And then that activity is just continuous. Mr. Hively and Mr. Roloff show you that the activity is continuous right up through that 9:54 call from Maxime Borcherding, and then the call, and then she barely has enough time to get herself ready to go down and have this, what she knew by then was likely to be a very painful, difficult interaction with everybody at OCI. So whether or not you're willing to accept the state's judgment, and it has been harsh judgment that's been heaped upon her about the financial choices that she and Dan Brophy made, pursuing their passions rather than acquiring as much money as they could as early in their lives as they could. Whether or not you think that you might react differently if you were to experience an event like this, that you would be sobbing in every event, at every turn. Whether or not that judgment is something that you can relate to. I want you to think about your responsibility here as jurors in this case, and the standard and the burden of proof, and whether those have anything to do with the way that you have to go about making these decisions. So much of that is really just can't lose for winning, can't win for losing argument. No matter which way she turns, there's going to be a criticism, and it's going to be a harsh criticism. Anything and everything is considered evidence of possible guilt. But that isn't the legal standard. That's not the standard for you to apply. Is it possible she could have done this? The standard you have to hold the state to is beyond a reasonable doubt, that there's no other reasonable possibility that you could reach. And unless you find that they have met that very, very high standard, you cannot return a verdict in the state's favor. Throughout this trial, and certainly today in this courtroom, throughout the state's presentation, the questions and the arguments have all foundered on this idea about whether something was possible. And I understand in a circumstantial case that we tend to do that, just as even though you don't have to find motive, you want to understand motive. Those things go together in a sense. But it has to be significantly more than that, more than whether it's just possible, whether that story makes sense, whether that could hold together, maybe whether that could be true. That kind of thinking stands the standard on its head. If you think there's any reasonable possibility that Nancy Brophy is not guilty? Any reasonable possibility. That's the phrase that you need to keep in mind. If there's any reasonable possibility that Nancy Brophy is not guilty, in other words, the possibility goes in her favor, not against her, you must give her the benefit of the doubt. You must return a verdict of not guilty. That's what the law requires. There is no standard for Nancy Brophy to meet. The rules are that the state, and the state alone, has the burden to convince you that events occurred as they contend they occurred. They can't just throw out possibilities and throw out theories and hope that you merely find them more plausible than any other theory. It isn't our job to prove a theory. It isn't our job to prove whether Oscar Taylor had a gun. Those burdens, all of those things, fall to the state to prove. And only if the state has convinced each of you firmly, beyond a reasonable doubt, that there's no other reasonable possibility, can you return a verdict in their favor. Nancy Brophy loved her husband. She loved that man. You could see that in her eyes every time she talked about him. Her eyes lit up. They absolutely twinkled when she was finally able to be out in a courtroom and talk about him. They sparkled. You heard a love story in this courtroom, in this trial. You heard about a love that blossomed each and every day they were together, right up to their very last day together. That love grew and grew and grew, and they were looking so forward to spending the rest of their lives together. Nancy Brophy chooses to be the strong person that she's always been. She's never been one to sob or display that kind of emotion in public. She thinks of herself as somebody who should be strong for others. She prides herself on that. She was raised to be that. Both of her parents were lawyers. You can imagine what that was like. She chooses to remember Dan Brophy in the garden. She chooses to remember him puttering around in their master kitchen. She chooses to remember him, to imagine him, to think forward and create memories of him still being with her, sitting on the porch that they intended to share as they slowed down a little bit. We should all wish for that kind of strength. So I want to close in thanking you again for your patience, your very steady attention that you paid throughout this entire long trial. I know that there were days that were interesting and days that were less so, but all of you were here and focused and present every single day. And that's a remarkable tribute to each of you as individuals, but also really in a social sense. This is a remarkable experience that people can come together and sit and peacefully talk about difficult things and come to a resolution. This has been an important gift that you have given all of the rest of us, and we appreciate that very much. It's also an awesome responsibility to carry with you because our system has provided no safety net for what you do. You are held in such high regard, and rightfully so, that the appellate court won't ever second guess the decision that you make, the factual decisions that you make, because you're the ones who are here in the courtroom with the witnesses. You're the ones who actually see people. You hear them testify. You can watch what they do. You see the complexity of how these pieces fit together. And no appellate judges, no panel of judges reading the transcripts, reading the black and white on the page could ever really take in as much as you've been able to take in. So that means that there isn't a safety net for your decision. You will be the ones who make this decision. If there's a mistake that's been made by one of the professionals in the room, they'll take a look at that. They understand what the mistakes are and how they should respond to those. But the factual decision is yours and yours alone. So having listened to the evidence as carefully as you have, we hope and believe that the conclusion that you'll reach is that the overwhelming majority of the evidence that you have heard does not support the state's version of the facts. That speculative approach, that speculative theory about how the facts might fit together, that might have happened, isn't sufficient, and that instead the evidence that you've been presented calls very strongly for a verdict of not guilty. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Overstreet, I'm thinking that rebuttal will be tomorrow morning unless you believe it's going to be very quick.
I mean, it will be brief, Your Honor, however, we still have to take down and set up, so
Right.
I
Okay,
couldn't say we'd finish before 5.
sure. Well, I guess I'll ask, do you think realistically by 5:15 or 5:20 or? Not sure, okay. All right, I'm gonna then excuse the jury for the day. We'll resume tomorrow at 9 with the state's rebuttal, then final instructions, and then have you break for deliberations.